When you get an idea for your next project and you jump into a headless content management system to start creating content types, you'll often hit a barrier. The CMS limits the type of data that you can store to only a few types. But why limit your imagination to just the primitive data types? With Kentico Content, your options are limitless. Using custom elements, it's possible to store and manage all types of data. Manage GPS coordinates using a map component. Edit video links using Vimeo or YouTube preview editors instead of copy-pasting URLs. Or even select a product directly from Shopify without leaving the headless CMS. Kentico Content offers a gallery of ready-to-use custom elements, or you can create your own using a JavaScript SDK. Don't let a CMS limit your creativity. Make it work for you and your project. Visit content.ai/developers. That's content with a K.ai/developers today. You can sign up without a credit card and start using custom elements right away with their 30-day full-featured trial or the free developer plan. Hi, this is Scott Hansel, and this is another episode of Hansel Minutes. Today I'm talking with Paulus Schoutsen. He is the founder of Home Assistant. How are you, sir?
I'm very good, thank you.
So you have not always been the lead and the founder of Home Assistant. You were a regular engineer like the rest of us. But at some point in your life, you decided to start automating things. Did you just, decide to pick a light in the house? Or how did it start?
So Home Assistant started around 7.5 years ago, and it actually started out as just a script in my house. So I had the new back then new, the Philips Hue lights got released, and I was like, wow, this is like smart lights, and it's like it has an API. So I wrote a small Python script to control the lights, and then I was like, okay, now I have a script, but what am I going to use it for, right? I want to have to apply it. So I made it so that the lights would turn on when the sun was setting. So then, I don't have to get off the couch when the sun is setting. Then I realized, it's actually turning the lights on too late. It's already dark when the sun is actually below the horizon. So I need to have an offset based on the percentage of the sun compared to the horizon. So 45 minutes-ish I started with. Then I realized, now the lights are being turned on when I'm not at home. So I need presence detection. And it kind of, it snowballed from there. And at some point, I put it on GitHub. That was really scary initially because I hadn't really put anything on GitHub. And I was like, everybody's going to judge my code. But the thing is, it's just a drop in the ocean, right? Nobody's just going to go to your profile and look at it. And so it was just fine. And for a long time, it was really just my playground. Every time I saw new technologies, I kind of jumped on it and added it to what then was already called Home Assistant. Started sharing a bit on the home automation subreddit. Got some more people interested. But it actually kind of really took off when I hit the front page of Hacker News. I had added material design, just launched by Google. And I had, as just one of my playground projects, I had implemented their material design elements based on the Polymer elements, they're web components, to Home Assistant. So all of a sudden it looked really slick. And that got on the front page of Hacker News. And then kind of from there, it started growing and growing. And now we're here. And last year we were the second most active Python project in the world, according to the GitHub State of the Octoverse. So, wow. Yeah, it's around 8,000 people had contributed to, in one way or the other, to our core of Home Assistant in the last year.
Oh my goodness, that's amazing. It seems like the last year is the beginning of that hockey stick. I'd always known about Home Assistant. It was a thing that nerds would talk about in places where nerds gathered. But the last year, we're stuck at home and everyone says, man, I don't want to get off the couch, like you said. Everyone else decided that they want to automate their homes. And it feels to me that it just exploded in the last maybe year and a half.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think that kind of, we started, not saying preparing for this moment, but 2.5 years, we started to have the first people working full time on Home Assistant. And one of the things we have focused on since then was making it easier. So a lot of open source projects start with text files for configuration. And what happens is that when you create text files for configurations, you limit your audience. And initially also it was a Python package only, so you had to like manage a Python virtual environment, limiting our audience even more, right? So we needed like, you need to be a system administrator, like the command line, you could automate your home. And pretty much since we had people working full time, and a little bit before that, we started building like configuration UI. We have our own operating system that you can flash on a Raspberry Pi, so you can update through the UI. So basically, if you want to do the normal stuff, not go super advanced, you actually don't even need a command line anymore, which is awesome. But just really has broadened our horizon of the people we can reach. And so, yeah, when people were all stuck at home, everybody was like, oh, hey, I can actually use this and I understand what's going on. And yeah, that's been really great.
It seems like it's almost like it should be an appliance. It always should have been an appliance. And by appliance, I just mean a thing you plug in and don't think about, whether it be a software appliance or a hardware appliance. I know that for a time there was the Home Assistant Blue. Is that still available?
No, it is still being made, but there's a severe component shortage in the world for technical pieces. And so we have been able to produce very little amounts. So pretty much they keep selling out within 24 hours. But I think we only made up to 3,000 now. So it's not even that much in like the grand scheme of like our world audience.
So it sounds like the best way for a person who's listening to this show to get started is either the Home Assistant operating system or on a container, maybe on a Synology or a NAS that they already have in their house.
Yeah, and so the Home Assistant operating system, we actually have images available for like Raspberry Pi 4, 3. Don't use the 2 or lower. They are available, but it's too slow. We have also images available for the Odroid, C4, the N2, the N2 Plus, which is like a competitor to Raspberry Pi. And then we also have images for the Asus Tinkerer, which is also another Raspberry Pi alternative. And then we have images for the Intel NUC. So that's more like a generic, like I want to flash this server or laptop, whatever, to Home Assistant operating system. But yeah, the container version is already a little bit more advanced in that you have to manage your own upgrades, right? Because you decide which containers are static, right? They don't update themselves. So what happens is that people have to update, like pull in the latest container to get the latest version. So that's just a little bit more work compared to just a click in the UI saying update.
So let's back up a little bit and talk about the history of home automation. The first time I automated something, I went to Radio Shack here in the US and I got an X10 device. And I can't remember, was it powered through the power? Like, did the signal go through the power in the walls, as I recall?
Yeah,
it was a
X10
waveform.
they send some signal on top of your electricity, and that's the way they communicate. But that was always a little tricky because they couldn't go past different groups, right? So if you had like different groups in your house, they actually couldn't communicate together.
It would have trouble going, depending on how you segmented the fuses in your house.
Right.
It was almost like a subnet of power, right? And there was also a radio-based protocol, and this had been around since the 70s. X10 was happening in the mid-70s, but it was never amazing. I don't think it really took over the world. It was another thing for just nerds. When do you think that home automation took off for like regular Joes and Janes out in the world?
I think it kind of started to be really like popular. There's two things that really added to it. One is that the dropping cost of microcontroller chips, right? So right now you can have an ESP8266 or an ESP32, which is like a very popular microcontroller, for like $1 or something. And it's like, so you put it in a light bulb, all of a sudden it has Wi-Fi, right? Or it can like do other home automation protocols. So that one really helped, but it also needed like a controller. People needed to have like a way to control the things in their house. And that really became popular with the Amazon Echo. So when Amazon introduced voice assistants, all of a sudden those hubs became like the center of the people's homes. But those hubs actually have a problem, is that, you know, the way big tech approaches ecosystems is that they tend to be, here I am, I'm big tech, implement my API, I'm not implementing yours. And so what started happening is that to add your device as a manufacturer to Amazon or Google, you can actually only talk to them through their cloud API. And that means now all of a sudden that light bulb you buy for $7 needs to have a cloud if it wants to connect to Google. which is annoying, so to speak, because then all of a sudden who's paying for that and all that stuff, right? So it is getting popular, but I'm also afraid of like this, I don't know, this doomsday in 5 years when the first manufacturers go out of business, their cloud stop working, and your lights go out.
It's interesting that you point that out, because when you start in a non-Amazon run environment, you get a couple of light bulbs from Signal and a couple from Hue and some from LiFX. And the next thing you know, you've got 7 apps on your phone and you're updating the firmware on effectively a little Linux computer in a light bulb. And they're routing every on and off all the way out across the world and back. And it's like, it seemed like a good idea at the time. But now, network enthusiasts like myself are so paranoid that we're starting to subnet our own networks. We have separate IoT Wi-Fi. We have separate VLANs. It really all should have been local from the start, shouldn't it have been? It's my house.
Yes, no, definitely. I think actually, if you look at so Philips Hue, they actually work local. So it's a Zigbee mesh network, and then that hub can talk to the cloud, and you can like connect to it with the app. But you can also talk locally to the hub. So, for example, Home Assistant, when we integrate with the Philips Hue lights, we don't use the cloud at all, right? We only talk locally, pull that data in, and then inside Home Assistant we decide automations or etc.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, there's a ton of light bulbs that just have a cloud API, and then we're just talking to the cloud, still pulling the data in, because Home Assistant, we focus on local control and privacy. So we're not going to run anything of Home Assistant in the cloud. We'll pull data from the cloud in, process it locally, and yeah, it's annoying because those cloud providers, they really don't like us, because we're going to ask every 30 seconds, what's the state of that light? Because, we need to know it for automation or whatever purposes.
Mm-hmm.
And that adds load again, right? So
yeah. So then Zigbee and Z-Wave are also things from the late 90s that really kind of like popped in the middle 2000s. And they are kind of less expensive than a WAN. They're not Wi-Fi. They're different radio frequency. They're kind of a short area thing. And I remember that it was confusing to me getting into home automation to keep track of which one was which. Did one of them win?
So
did we decide?
No. So there's been, it's an interesting world. So Z-Wave uses like a sub-gigahertz radio frequency, so it doesn't conflict with Wi-Fi, for example. But because they had to get spectrum in every continent, they have different frequencies, so they're not compatible. You cannot get US in Europe, but it goes further, but it has less data. Zigbee works on 2.4 gigahertz, so it conflicts with Wi-Fi. So that is really annoying. Like if you have the same channel, you can your Zigbee network can get impacted. But Zigbee had a less strict system of who could make chips for it. And so what started happening is that where Z-Wave had only one provider of chips. So a lot of manufacturers like IKEA or Philips, they actually all went for Zigbee because they had the choice of who would provide the chips. But then Zigbee wasn't really reliable always, and so now they're actually working on another standard where all the bodies are coming together. It's called CHIP, and that might be it's called Connected Home over IP. And so it's still going to run on 2.4 gigahertz, but it uses Thread as the mesh layer instead of Zigbee, which is better. And then, so no, there's no winner. Okay. I think that's the summary. And I think So right now, I think if you want to have cheap mesh local network, there's a lot of Chinese manufacturers making Zigbee stuff.
Okay.
And Z-Wave stuff might be on the horizon because the Z-Wave Alliance just allowed people to buy Z-Wave chips without actually having a certified product, which means that also Chinese manufacturers might be able to, things manufactured in China, I have to say, right? It doesn't have to be Chinese firms making it. And there might be cheaper chips coming. But it's tricky all.
Okay, so then trying to tie all this together, Amazon made it easy because they built in Zigbee and Z-Wave in certain echoes. They made it feel fun because they've got the voice, but then they're sending voice to the cloud. They're sending on-off commands to the cloud depending on the device and how the device is paired. It became a hub of sorts, but it's, as someone who has an Amazon-enabled house, it's not a particularly sophisticated hub. But you're talking about a Raspberry Pi or a Docker container. I understand those from a software perspective, but then how do they reach out to the physical world? How do I go from a Docker container on my Synology into, Zigbee, or how do I go from a Raspberry Pi? Are there dongles? Are there radios?
Yeah, so there's just dongles available. So it's a USB stick that has a Z-Wave or a Zigbee radio or both, and you plug them into the same device where Home Assistant is running, and then they speak a serial protocol, and so Home Assistant can talk the serial protocol of the stick. But nowadays we're also experimenting. Like there's standalone Zigbee and Z-Wave hubs that are integrated into Home Assistant, so that way we can go through like a different product that you have at home locally. And we're also having these like WebSocket servers around these sticks for Z-Wave now. So you can have your Z-Wave stick somewhere in your house, have a small WebSocket server, and Home Assistant communicates with it over, your Wi-Fi or LAN.
That's really interesting. So it's location transparency, even where one device may not be optimally positioned in the house, but the other one can be
right. Yeah. So if you have all your server gear in the basement, that's of course not a nice place to have all your mesh messages go to. Depending on where you live, it might be stone or whatever, right, or concrete. So if you could like position your stick somewhere else more positively, that it's part of the mesh network, that's better.
Mm-hmm. Hey friends, I want to share a great deal with you from our friends at CBT Nuggets. They're expert IT training where and when you need it. It's online. You can go and check out what you need from IT training, networking, cloud, security. There's 40 hours of new training added every week. And their team is 100% in-house, and they're all active IT professionals with multiple certifications. They've got virtual labs, so that's on-demand environments that are tailored to the course material that you're taking. So you get to practice networking config, scripts, queries alongside the course. They've even got accountability coaching. So this is a service that's available to all learners with a subscription. It's a coaching team that is actually integrated with the trainer and the content team, so you can talk to a real person. They'll help you craft a personalized learning plan. You can set goals, and they'll check in to help you keep accountable. Now, they've set up a promotional offer for us. It's a free learner offer, so you can go to cbtnuggets.com/Hansel-minutes. You just sign up. They've made portions of their most popular courses completely free. You just need a Google account. You can start training right away. And if you sign up for the free learner, you'll be automatically entered into a drawing, and you could win a 6-month premium subscription to CBT Nuggets. That's cbtnuggets.com/Hansel-minutes. And the number one thing that keeps getting kind of pounded through the documentation, through the getting started for everything in Home Assistant is privacy and total control. Nothing is hidden from you at any point.
Right. Yeah. So, when you use products that have stored the data in the cloud, you don't always have access to all the data. And all those manufacturers that have their own clouds are kind of like silos, right? You cannot automate across those silos of data. And what we saw is that then, of course, there's a service called If This Then That, where manufacturers can choose to expose certain parts of their data, and then it kind of can get combined. But that costs money. It's slow because it goes through the cloud, and you're reliant on like having an internet connection for your house to work. So the thing we do with Home Assistant is that we pull all that data locally. We have all these APIs for you to access this data, but we also have a whole data science portal where you can see our database layout. With Jupyter notebooks, you can immediately have run queries on your own data. And we're not going to hold your data hostage, right? So we really want people to be able to play with their data. And what we see is actually, we see a lot of people experimenting with their own data and then making this available. So there's like various different automation engines that you can use, that if you don't want to use the Home Assistant automation engine, you can use your own. And it's really because of the openness, we see just people build on top like other awesome things that like we wouldn't have had the time or even thought of ourselves. And that's just really cool to see.
One of the things that you probably didn't think of, but I think is really important, is what's called Night Scout and Night Scout integration to Home Assistant. So I'm a type 1 diabetic, and I have an implant that shows me my blood sugar every 5 minutes. And there is a Night Scout integration that allows me to see my blood sugar in Home Assistant, because it's just a piece of data on the WAN or on the local the personal area network, where personal is me. So rather than a moisture sensor in the garden, which is a thing you can do with Home Assistant, my blood sugar can actually exist in Home Assistant as well, which is amazing.
Yeah, and then the next step will be that you can like make a light blink red, for example, if you need to do something.
That's a really great point, and that's something that you want to make, available to the non-programmer, right?
Yeah.
So the regular person should be able to go and say, if my child's blood sugar is low, play some music, turn on a thing to red, alert the family.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that the nice thing about Home Assistant is that like there's a way for users to like sponsor Home Assistant, but you don't have to, right? You can run Home Assistant completely local if you want. And this way, we're making this software and these features available to everyone, right? You don't have to, live in like a rich country with a good health insurance to pay a monthly subscription to get like your light flash red if your, you know, sugar levels are low or something. So I think it's really cool. We just launched analytics like last week. It's an opt-in way, so people can show where they are living and like which version they run. And it's available, like we make it all transparently, publicly available on like analytics.homeassistant.io. But it's really cool to see because we cover like the majority of the world. We still miss a couple of African countries, but for the rest, like South America is fully covered. A lot of Asian countries are covered. And so it's really cool to see that, across the whole world, even on like super tiny islands. I was just looking at like Reunion and Mauritius, which are two tiny islands east of Madagascar. Well, there's people running Home Assistant.
Yeah, I'm looking at analytics.homeassistant.io. And again, these are just people who have opted in because this is all, opt in. There's people in Iran and Iraq, people all over all the little islands of Micronesia, Indonesia, all throughout there. So as more and more people, start to share their data, you'll be able to see all the Kenyans and the Angolans that have got Home Assistant, and they're taking control of their stuff. One of the other things that I think is interesting about Home Assistant as a philosophy is that if there's a device in the house that should connect to it, it seems like you all just say, that should connect. So Home Assistant Cast, which came out a couple of years ago, the idea that, hey, I have a Google Chromecast, I should be able to throw Home Assistant up there. It's the kind of thing that a company wouldn't decide to do.
Right.
But an open source project does.
Yeah, so we are constantly trying to I call it playing, right? Like we have just all this technology in our house, and the moment we have an API for it, we can start combining things together. And so, the Home Assistant Cast was just this great example. And Google was not too fond of it because we had to, the Google Home hubs have a touch screen, but they are not allowed to touch the Cast applications normally. But I found a way to bypass it. And then, all of a sudden you can actually interact with your Home Assistant UI on the Home Assistant, on the Google Home Hub. And that was really cool. And this is just the kind of stuff that somebody builds it and then we share it and then everybody has it. And then
you wrote about this in 2016, where you talked about what perfect home automation looks like, and you kind of decided and laid out a philosophy as a project, as a company, that you shouldn't have to adapt to technology; the technology should adapt to you.
Correct. Yeah, I think that it's super important because if technology gets in your way, you either stop using it or you adjust to it, to the limitations of the technology that you impose yourself, and that doesn't make any sense. So, for example, one of the things that when people change to smart lights, a lot of times they're like, don't touch the light buttons anymore because now we need to use our app or our voice. But that's really silly because if you enter a room, what is the fastest way to turn on the lights? Is that light switch, right? So that's kind of the thing is like, no, if you have like a house, like if you own the house, right? Like how homeowners compared to renters, it's like a different choice of technology. But if you are a homeowner, you need to make sure that you update your light switches as well to work with this, for example. And that's like, but also with like, the example I always give is with automations. If you automate the living room lights to dim when you start watching a movie, well, what if somebody's reading a book, right? You're now like annoying them. So if you cannot get your home automation to be like 95 or 98% right, or there's going to be false positives where it fires where it shouldn't, don't do it.
Hmm. I've talked about the spouse acceptance factor, and for very many years I've been working on a book that I'm never going to finish about living in a mixed marriage where one is a geek and one is not. Whether it's the woman who's an engineer and the man who is not, or vice versa, there's always a situation where one person loves the idea of automating the house, and the other partner just wants to turn on the freaking light.
Yeah.
In my particular relationship, my wife is not interested in any of our home automation technologies. So if my spouse appreciates it, if my partner says this is a good technology, then I know that it's a good technology.
Yeah. Well, that's actually where the voice assistants have been really appreciated by everybody in the house here. For example, adding things to the shopping list, quickly setting timers. That stuff is just so, it just happens. And, it's just part of our life. And now my son is 3.5, and he has been he knows about Google for a long time, but he never dared to talk to it. And so recently he has started to learn to, like, he dares to talk to it. And now he will be like, make the lights red. Or he found this Cars adventure and he's having this whole audio game he's doing. And it's just, he really likes it. So it's really cool to see how he's like playing with it as well.
Mm-hmm. So if I look at your LinkedIn, I can see the different places that you worked, and I can see where Home Assistant overlapped while you were working on it at night. And then you can see when you quit and decided to do this full time. It's an open source project, but as we all know, it's really hard to make money and pay the rent when you're doing open source. How did Home Assistant find a sustainable way to be successful, open, and private, but also allow you and the others to work on it full time?
Yeah, so I think that what makes Home Assistant different compared to the majority of open source projects out there is that we are actually, we have actually work with users directly, right? So the consumers of our project are not companies that are building like some forms and that need like some UI toolkit for that. No, we're actually shipping stuff that people run directly in their home. And so when we got to the point of like, okay, this is too big to handle, right? Where like I would work on it before work, I would work on it after work, my weekends would just be like doing Home Assistant. And at some point it was like, my son was born, and I was like, okay, I cannot do this anymore. And so what we figured out is that the best way we can do this, we actually looked at what is challenging right now to do in Home Assistant. And so if you want Home Assistant, the thing Home Assistant runs locally. So it means when you're outside of your house, you cannot access Home Assistant by default because you cannot just, go through your router and connect to Home Assistant. So people had to like set up an SSL certificate. They had to do port forwarding, get a dynamic DNS, and then you have to like renew that certificate. And that was just kind of tricky, and people don't really feel interested in doing that, or at least some people are, but we're also trying to reach the bigger audience, and the bigger audience is not interested in opening ports on their router. So we were able to actually introduce a new service for like $5 a month called Home Assistant Cloud, which will actually end-to-end encrypted route your data or route your connection through your Home Assistant instance at home. So you're talking still directly to your own Home Assistant instance with your configuration, your version, all that stuff, but it's routed outside of your network via our systems, but encrypted. And then the same problem actually occurred for like Google and Amazon, because Google and Amazon, they don't work with decentralized systems. They just want to have a single place on the internet where they say, I have a message for a Home Assistant user, deal with it. And so that's also where Home Assistant Cloud, knowing where your instance lives, we can forward this information from Amazon and Google. Now you can still set up Amazon and Google yourself, and it actually runs the same. The processing of the messages happens all locally. So you can actually see exactly what happens. And so if you run your own version that you set up, or you run Home Assistant Cloud, it's the same logic. So the only thing we really do is we get that message to your instance. And
Interesting.
and this has worked really well. So right now we actually have 10 people work on Home Assistant full
Wow.
time. Yeah. And it's been great. So this is just people around the world that are just paying $5 a month. And then, we obviously don't hire in California, right? But it's it's working really well. And we even acquired another open source project last month. So there was an open source project called ESP Home, which is an open source firmware for microcontrollers. So if you want to build your own sensors or small devices or like fun stuff in the house. And that maintainer, he just couldn't handle it anymore. He had too much like commitments in his real life, lost his interest, but he was still getting like Patreons come in. So we decided to like buy him out and, hire someone full time to work on it, because it really helps like with open source home automation to have, all these small nodes that you can also fully control and integrate. So yeah, it's been going very well. And the way we run the Home Assistant as an open source project is that, we know that people don't per se have to pay for us. Like they can go local completely, right? So it is very important. We are just constantly investing in our community. We're just constantly making sure that like our community is happy. There's no investors, there's no loans or anything, right? So it's really, we keep the community happy. They will fund us. We will, have people work on Home Assistant, etc., etc. And so yeah, we're just doing fun stuff the whole time, and people love it.
That's really cool that you're actually expanding in two directions, though, because you're making it better, fewer text files, less stuff for the non-technical person to do. You're lowering the barrier to entry, both financially and technically. But at the same time, you're also enabling someone to say, hey, I have custom firmware, and if you want to check if this pin is at 5 volts or not, we'll turn that into a Home Assistant object that can then be managed in the dashboard. So you've made it more accessible to the non-technical and the profoundly technical.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think for us, the super technical people, that's our original, the OG users, right? So it's very important also for us to keep them happy, because they, in the end, are the ones that come up with all the wild ideas. And occasionally one of those wild ideas will transition to be like, we make it a generally accessible idea. And to kind of highlight one of those ideas, at some point somebody made a video how he used an RFID reader with cards that he printed up music albums, and he would like scan them in his living room on this RFID reader, and it would start playing that music on his music system. And we're like, this is really cool. So we actually rebuilt this with ESP Home and like an ESP8266 chip. So now people for like $7-8 can build this themselves. And then it's smooth, it's like seamlessly integrates in Home Assistant. So you can have your own jukebox at home. And so, for example, my son, when he was 1 year old, he was already able to change the music in our living room, because he had all these cards with his favorite children's songs, and he could like play them one at a time. It was really cool. And this is something that like anyone can now build and have accessible.
That is so cool. So now I have to go after this podcast and consider how I'm going to migrate my house and all of my devices over to Home Assistant. Folks can check this out at homeassistant.io, home-assistant.io. They can also learn about the Home Assistant Cloud, the new subscription service by the partner Nabukasa at homeassistant.io/cloud. I'm going to include links in the show notes for everyone. And also be sure to follow Home Assistant on Twitter. They're very active and they have a very, very welcoming community. Thank you so much, Paulus, for chatting with me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
This has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and we'll see you again next week.